Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Chatham House. My name is James Nixie. I'm the head of the Russia and Eurasia program here. When we conceived of this title 3 or 4 weeks ago, Insights into Ukraine's Political Crisis, we were, of course, talking about another crisis. There's been 5, 6, or 7 more since then, but it still holds valid, the title, even if we meant it differently at the time. We have got a wealth of expertise and really up-to-date knowledge after the conversation we've just been having in the green room equivalent backstage, and I think you won't find any better or deeper analysis of the very difficult situation in Ukraine than we have right here. Having said that, of course, I suppose it is possible to have events which are too topical, and if we'd had this event last week or 2 weeks ago, it would have been very different, and if we have it next week, I'm sure it'll be very different again. I need to do a couple of admin notices, if I may, please. Firstly, we're on the record. Secondly, we are being live streamed, so behave. Thirdly, people can comment on Twitter using the hashtag #CHEvents, and they can ask questions using hashtag AskCH. Most of you who know me will know that I didn't understand what I just said. Please, finally, if you would put your phones on silent, we'd be very grateful. Very briefly, by way of introduction, on my immediate right, Arisia Lutsevich is a research fellow here on the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. She's working on a project on Russian influence in civil society in Ukraine, Armenia, and Moldova. To Arisia's right is Robert Brinkley. Robert is a former ambassador in Ukraine. He is also former head of a political section in the embassy in Moscow, and now is chairman of the Bear Trust, that's British emergency aid to Russia and the republics. And to my far right, Alexei Solobienko is was formerly head of the Eurasia service at the BBC and is now news and deployments editor for BBC Global News.
Before we start, may I ask if the loop system is turned on?
The what system?
The loop system.
The loop system.
Hearing.
Yep, we'll do that. Fair enough. Thank you very much. Our speakers will speak for approximately 8 minutes each, and then we'll have about 30 to 40 minutes worth of questions and discussion. So we're going in the order we have here. So Arisia first, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We hope to stand up to James' expectations in terms of expertise, but I've been following personally this revolution, Euro-revolution, uprising in Ukraine. Different names are attached to what's happening in Ukraine now for over 3 months. Very closely. And a lot of images that we've seen on the front covers of media were orange burning fires, and a lot of memories were coming back to Orange Revolution in 2004, which was very peaceful. And I thought to myself that this brings back these orange flashbacks on the scene as a reminder that this was an unfinished revolution in 2004. That was part of the frustration that the old system of governance remained in Ukraine. Today we have a very important step forward, and in a way a battle that was won in Ukraine by having a new government voted in the parliament by 331 votes. It's quite substantial support to the government, including from the former ruling party of now fugitive President Yanukovych, Party of Regions. The parliament established a new coalition, which is called the European Choice Coalition, that includes all opposition parties that used to be opposition, party of former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko and Arseniy Yatsenyuk, party of ex-boxer Vitali Klitschko, Party of Freedom Svoboda, the Nationalist Party, and 2 independent members groups. So we have a government that was formed in Ukraine today in a way, in an unprecedented way. This government is a pro-reform government, and this government has a lot of new faces, a lot of professional people in it, and clearly the core of this government is coming from the circle of newly appointed Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who is very young himself, but who has already some of the experience as the acting chief of National Bank, as a foreign minister, as the Minister of Economy, and the chairman of the parliament. He brought together a team of people. The lead Minister of Foreign Affairs is also an experienced young diplomat who was Andriy Deshchitsa, former chairman. He led the chairmanship of Ukraine at OSCE over the last year. The economic bloc is very interesting too, because the Minister of Economy is Pavlo Sheremeta, a former advisor to Malaysian Prime Minister, never a member of any political party, but somebody who is very much on the liberal side of cutting down the red tape, liberalizing economy, developing small and medium enterprise. The Minister of Justice, and a huge task that he has to restore trust and rule of law in the country, is also coming from his inner circle, and is an experienced lawyer. Another surprise, in a way, we can take it as a surprise, that there are so many people who have never been in government and coming from civil society. There are about 6 of them now who are in charge of very important task of fighting the corruption in Ukraine. They're establishing a new anti-corruption committee. They're also trying to clean in the officials who are already in government, specifically judges, to look at their record if they have been involved in any kind of corrupt practices before. Interestingly also, Yulia Tymoshenko, a representation on the government is quite weak. These are the 2 people from her former cabinet, and this is the Minister of Minister of Energy and Minister of Labor. But it's important to pay attention to the Minister of Energy, because energy is a very corrupt pool of practices in Ukraine, and it's a very key ministerial appointment. Finally, Vitali Klitschko is not represented in government at all. He said he will run for president. But his member of his party is appointment head of Ukrainian security services, Mr. Nalivaychenko, also an experienced professional who was leading the service during Yushchenko's administration. So what does this mean, this new government for Ukraine? This is really not a government of national unity in a way of including a former party of regions representatives on board. This is a pro-reform government, the government of people who have no presidential ambitions. Mr. Yatsenyuk today stated that he will not run for president of Ukraine, and he will implement very unpopular reforms that are urgently needed for the country. This government has huge challenges to deal with, starting from internal security issues. We have been all following events in Crimea. And already today, right after appointment, the key people in the Interior Ministry, in the security services, said they are dealing with the Crimean issue. The government said that number 2 priority is signing an association agreement with the European Union, and they hope to do it in the coming weeks. Formally, Ukraine is now complying the famous or infamous EU requirements, freeing Yulia Tymoshenko, restoring selective justice, and changing electoral code. This government taking the business seriously, because when I looked at the program presented today in the parliament, it includes changes to 35 laws. So not only they will try to get some financial assistance from the West that is very much needed for Ukraine, but they are making a very serious statement in terms of rebooting the system of governance in Ukraine and making a serious effort in that direction. Another very daunting task is to restore justice, in a way dealing with transitional justice. Ukraine has never suffered the human loss that we've seen, 80 people killed, and these people demand justice. On the condition when there's no trust to a legal system in Ukraine, this will be very difficult to achieve, and already the Minister of Interior is reporting daily, trying to report on some of his actions that he is taking in this direction. Ukrainian system and the crisis was partly caused by a very close links between businesses and politics, and this is the knot that new government has to cut. This is something that is hopeful because we don't see people attached to famous or big financial clans in the government. We see a lot of people coming from various groups. So achieving this split between government and politics is important. And the fact that another famous opposition leader, Petro Poroshenko, who is a chocolate magnate, so to say, in Ukraine, is not leading the government, is not even in the government, is a positive sign. Party of Regions officially declared that they are in the opposition. This is a healthy statement, I think. Any democracy needs strong opposition. Let's hope that they will really behave in a way that they stated. So taking all these pressures and challenges in an account, it's really daunting for the new government. But I was thinking, looking through a lot of pictures of young protesters on the streets, this is the biggest challenge. The new government is under the magnifying glass. Every step they make is judged. Maidan, or the people on the Independence Square, they want to see change, and they will not let it go easily. And I think that this is the biggest test that they have to do, because Ukrainians feel that they did this revolution on their own, and they deserve to control this government, and they want to see concrete steps taking place. Thank you.
Thanks, Arisia. Thanks for talking about the makeup of a government and the challenges ahead. Robert, you got back from Ukraine this morning. You've been there for the last 5 or 6 days, and I know you're going to talk about perhaps the way ahead and some of the Western, including Russian, responses.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, James. I've spent the last 6 days, 3 in Lviv in Western Ukraine, then 3 in Kiev. And what has been happening there is obviously hugely dramatic, tragic and historic days for Ukraine. There was a turning point on Friday, Saturday, when the regime crumbled and Yanukovych ran away. But the crisis is most certainly not over. On Monday, I walked around in the Maidan, in Independence Square and Hrushevskovo Street, where the fighting had been. And the thing that struck me most was that already, in the space of 2 or 3 days, it had been completely cleaned up. It was very orderly. The barricades have all been rebuilt and cobblestones neatly piled up for use as ammunition if necessary. And there were plenty of guys walking around in hard hats, flak jackets, who mean business. I lived through the Orange Revolution in Kiev 10 years ago, and by comparison, that felt much more like a carnival. This time, this is much more somber. And of course, all those people have lost their lives, and hundreds more have been injured. And they're still there. They're not going away. There is no euphoria this time, no illusions about what may happen. And I think that is a lesson that the people of Ukraine learnt after the Orange Revolution. That time, when they got what they wanted, which was a rerun of the election and Yushchenko being elected, they packed up, closed the camp and went away. And then within just a few months, the politicians, the new politicians, were back to the bad old ways. This time, what people were saying to me was a fear of one dictatorship being replaced by another. Or in the phrase I heard from one person, the occupiers have been replaced by marauders. Indeed, one of my business friends there, a medium-sized businessman, told me that even in the last couple of days, one of the new people had offered to protect his business. Acting President Turchinov, who has for a long time been very close to Yulia Tymoshenko, introduced the acting Interior Minister, Avakov, who's also another one from that party, to his ministry on Saturday afternoon. And Turchinov said, well, the Maidan has won, and now they can all go home. That was not what the Maidan wanted to do. And that evening, by the time Yulia Tymoshenko was out of prison and appearing on the stage, she was saying to them, you must stay here. And that is what they're doing. So what we have now, as Arisia has already mentioned, there are now three different sets of political forces. There's not just the old government and the new government. There's also now those people on the Maidan representing the revolution who are determined to hold the politicians to account. And they really are pretty cynical about politicians as a whole, both the new ones and the old ones. Yesterday evening, the new ministers were presented to the crowd on the Maidan, and some of them were booed. And it started off as a fairly orderly session with people being introduced, and I was watching it on television and just sort of disintegrated and became more chaotic as it went on. This is direct democracy, and I think we're going to see rather more of that in the next few weeks. There are calls now to, this is from the Maidan, to ban the Communist Party, to disband the Party of Regions, for what they call lustration, for a big list of people who should not serve in public office. And there is a revolutionary fervour there. Now, in this situation, there are obviously some very big risks. The immediate risk is that the government, the central government, loses control of what is happening around the country, that there is disorder. The militia are badly demoralized because they were used by the old regime to attack the people. They've lost the trust of the people, and already in many places around the country, self-defense militias have been set up and are on patrol. There is a risk of the country fragmenting, particularly in the east and the south, and very much in Crimea at the moment, where there are more of the Russian speakers. And there are signs that there are quite a lot of people in Crimea who don't want to be subordinate to the new government in Kiev. There is also the enormous economic challenge. Ukraine is heavily indebted and faces a risk of default if they don't get this right and get major assistance quite quickly. The currency has already devalued by 25% over the last couple of months. And perhaps the biggest worry of all that I heard from all the Ukrainians I've been talking to in the last few days was, what is Russia going to do? This was another huge failure by the Russian leadership to understand Ukraine. A humiliating setback. They really very seriously misjudged what the reaction would be in Ukraine. And unfortunately, they have had a very well organized, coordinated campaign of lies. And I think it would be no exaggeration to say that what we've seen, what we're still seeing, is a campaign of which Goebbels would have been proud. It bears very little resemblance to what has actually been happening in Ukraine. And unfortunately, they've had a fairly easy run because so many people in the international media don't understand about Ukraine. Russia fears that Ukraine is now going to slip out of their sphere of influence, but they also fear what this means for their own control, the control of Putin and his regime in Russia. They've already been stirring things up with a congress in Kharkiv last Saturday of representatives from the eastern and southern regions, which was attended by the chairpersons of the Foreign Affairs Committee of both houses of the Russian Parliament and by 4 governors from neighboring Russian regions. In Crimea, they have the Black Sea Fleet, and that means they also have thousands of troops on the ground in Sevastopol, which could possibly be reinforced. And what we're seeing at the moment is a struggle for control going on in Sevastopol in the city and more widely in Crimea, focused on its capital, Simferopol. 3/5 of the people living in Crimea are Russians, Russian speakers, but there are a third who are not, who are either Ukrainians or Crimean Tatars, who will resist very strongly any Russian attempt to take over. Finally, how have the outside world, particularly the European Union and the United States, reacted to all this? I think the part that was played last week by the three foreign ministers of Germany, France, and Poland was absolutely crucial. Not only did they fly to Kiev to talk to Yanukovych, but they then decided they would stay, and they stayed altogether for 30 hours of constant negotiation. They stayed until they had negotiated an agreement between Yanukovych and the opposition. And at one point towards the end, Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, had a shouting match with the leaders of the Maidan and told them, you are all going to get killed if you don't let this agreement go through. Those three foreign ministers did a terrific job. And what they did, in effect, they were midwives to the transition of power, because, of course, the next day, or even before they left, the regime was crumbling, Yanukovych ran away. And before their signatures were dry on the paper, the agreement was overtaken. But they did a very important job. First priority now is to help the new government stabilize the country and restore order, and then to help the new government clean up the institutions of Ukraine, introduce democratic controls, and there may well be a role that some of the countries which have recently come from the East into the European Union can play, helping to advise urgently on the best way to do that. There's going to be a presidential election on the 25th of May. There's a very strong demand from the street, from the square, for parliamentary election, but cooler heads are saying, let's not do everything at once, not throw all the pieces up in the air at the same time. So it remains to be seen when that will happen, but great dissatisfaction with the present composition of Parliament. There will need to be a big financial assistance package. People have been talking about a need for $30 or $40 billion over the next 2 years. The International Monetary Fund are best placed to coordinate this. Another very important message at the moment is we in the West must not be triumphalist about this, not back Russia into a corner. We've got to find ways of making Russia part of the solution. Perhaps it would be possible, maybe this is too hopeful, to tie in Russia's financial assistance with a wider package. Perhaps there can be some sort of negotiation with Ukraine about what is the future status and international relations of Ukraine. Not over Ukraine's head, but involving Ukraine and discussing it with them. Zbigniew Brzezinski has suggested in the Financial Times the other day, maybe there could be some agreement that Ukraine could have non-bloc status as well as association with the EU. Let's see, there are various possibilities. One thing I'm quite sure of, though, Ukraine is not going to join the Eurasian Union.
Okay, Robert, thank you very much indeed for that somewhat gloomy point of view, but no doubt realistic. Alexei, I know you're going to talk a little bit about the chances of success, so I don't know if you can be a little less gloomy, I'm not sure, and maybe some possible futures. I know you're also off to Ukraine tomorrow.
Chances of success, thank you for offering such a fruitful topic for me. I did 2 drafts and threw them away because the situation is changing so quickly. So now I have 2 presentations for you, one very short, the other is the one that I'm going to deliver now. The one that is short is the chances of success with outside intervention. That I think the answer will be bloodbath, and it will be a very, very serious conflict on European soil. However, I think the more realistic scenario is chances of success without intervention. So what I think is interesting, in my view, to look at, the government, just to add to what Arisa was saying, I think the government is certainly not inclusive, and they've already made a very, very big mistake. In one of their first acts, they decided to repeal the law on regional Russian language as a regional language in Ukraine. And I think even the leading politicians on the revolutionary front, if you may call them so, they say this is a big mistake. However, the revolutionary fervor and some anti-Russian feelings among a certain part of very vocal MPs have prevailed. I think this is a big mistake, which is now being picked up on by the opposition in parliament, by members of the Party of Region, and certainly by Russian diplomats, and this is something that is being mentioned constantly in repeated statements from the Russian Foreign Ministry as one of the examples of this kind of brown plague overcoming Ukraine. So that's one thing. The second thing that about the government, I think, is that there are quite a few unsavory characters there. There are some people with, say, rather right-wing views, some people who are advocating total ban on abortions, for instance. Some of the leading lights of the revolution, of the protests, whatever your take on the events, have refused to join the government, but they're supportive from the outside. I think two protesters there, Tatiana Chornovol, who is the investigative journalist who was badly beaten in the car, you probably remember the horrible scenes. She is now looking after the anti-corruption committee. I hope she will do a very fair job, and perhaps will give the right of reply also to the people she will be accusing. And the vetting commission, the illustration committee, which is now headed by the person who was leading after Maidan, this automobile activists who were either driving protesters around the city or blocking the roads, and who was also abducted and badly beaten. He is now looking after the vetting committee. So, but that's the government, and the government will have quite a few problems of its own. When Mr. Turchinov was introducing the lineup of the government on the Maidan on Independence Square, he said that this government will burn within 3 months, that they're sacrificial lambs, they're sacrificing themselves for the future of Ukraine because they will have to take extremely unpopular decisions. They haven't announced those decisions yet, but the financial situation is so dire that the current account is empty. They need 3.3 billion by the end of the week in order to pay pensions, to pay salaries, to pay quite a lot of stuff. 15 billion, as far as I understand, by the end of this month, which is this week. And also, I think the capital flight from Ukraine over the past week, at least $3.1 billion have been withdrawn. I think hryvnia today slipped to 11.4. When I was there 2 weeks ago, it was around 9. So this gives you the scale of the the scale of the devaluation, and it's not clear whether it will be stopped because the National Bank probably would like to intervene, but it doesn't have the money. So very, very serious challenges ahead, and very, very quickly, very soon. But in terms of authority of the government, we spoke about the ministers, we spoke about the program. They seem to have sorted the authority issue because the army has pledged allegiance, Ministry of the Interior has pledged allegiance, Security Service seems to be now under control. All three are leaking very important documents to the government investigative committee under Mr. Moskal, and these documents are being published, and we can talk a little bit more about it. Regional authorities have pledged allegiance to the central authorities quite forcefully. I don't think that we can probably now talk about, Ukraine being fractured, because with the exception of the Crimea, all the regional governors, all the regional parliaments, even the most vocal anti-protesters, if we look at Kharkiv, for instance, the second largest city of Ukraine, and Mr. Kernes and Mr. Dobkin, the governor and the mayor, one of whom was saying that there's no such thing as peaceful protesters in Ukraine, they're vermin who should be physically exterminated. This is his tweet, this is his quote. They're now saying that actually Mr. Yanukovych is a page in history, that new authorities need to be supported, that they certainly never advocated secessionism, they are all for united Ukraine, and they will work together with central authorities and in parliament. Which is very important, I think, with the exception of Crimea. Certainly the Crimea, I think what happened yesterday, if I can use the phrase, I think the Crimean Tatars have changed the course of history. And maybe this is something that is still unnoticed, but I think when they managed to bring out about 15,000 protesters who joined the pro-Ukrainian protesters and confronted the pro-Russian protesters, I think they showed, certainly to the international media and to lots of Ukrainians and hopefully to people in Russia, is that Crimean politics is not the one-dimension politics, not the pop group, but direction. Sorry, one direction, yes. That there are other factors as well. that Crimean Tatars should be reckoned with, that they have their own interests, they have their own representation, and they have ability to mobilize. Today, when the Crimean parliament overnight was seized by two pro-Russian groups who then hoisted Russian flags, and they used weapons. There was a bit of a shootout, but nobody was killed. And the leader of Crimean Tatars, Mustafa Jamilov, told his supporters to stay away and not to get involved. I think if the Tatars are involved, I think the whole picture of what's going on in Crimea will change dramatically. So Crimea remains the problem area. It doesn't help that today 5 armored personnel carriers of the Russian naval unit were seen on the streets of Simferopol. At first, there was no confirmation, but then the Russian Foreign Ministry said, yes, this is their APCs, and there's nothing wrong in it, and they don't have to notify anyone. But just like the drill and the fighter bombers flying across the Ukrainian border, of course, you know, the official line is this is all coincidence, but it's not viewed as a coincidence, certainly in Ukraine and elsewhere. Now, in Parliament, the opposition, I think the interesting question is about what the opposition are doing. And the opposition are basically already attacking and criticizing the government, saying what's going on in the Crimea is their fault, is their responsibility, and they're not doing enough to do it, to sort out the situation. Now, I think one other thing that I wanted to discuss is something that we are certainly getting, as the BBC, we have a very, very large deployment now on the ground. We have people in Lviv, we have people in Kharkiv, we have people in Simferopol, Sevastopol, and other places, and we've sent teams basically across Ukraine to villages, to towns. And what we're getting is very interesting. Certainly the divisions may be pronounced in the cities and squares of large industrial centers, but you drive 20 kilometers outside and the question of secession or separation or some kind of autonomy or not yielding to the central authority, it doesn't exist. It just doesn't appear. I think yesterday in Kharkiv there was a very, very interesting thing when there was this small group of 40 people guarding the monument to Lenin. And there was an interview with one boy, 16, maybe 17, a youth who was speaking decent English under the banners of the Communist Party, saying that we're here to defend this against the fascists. And when asked, so against the fascists, do you mean people from Western Ukraine? He said, yes, people from Western Ukraine. But we want to be in one Ukraine. We want to keep the country together, but without the fascists. So there's propaganda about the fascists, there are some right-wing groups. Just one final thing about right-wing groups, maybe these questions will arise, I think. There's a lot of talk about right sector and their representation or lack of it in the new lineup. I think Mr. Yarosh, the leader, may appear as one of the deputies of the National Security and Defense Council, which is now headed by Mr. Porubi, who was the commandant of the whole protest. He was in charge of security, of logistics, of everything else. So this will be quite an interesting mark. But one of the key accusations against them, and they were all the time portrayed as anti-Semites, Nazis, fascists. They had a very interesting meeting with the Israeli ambassador today in Kiev. There was a very interesting discussion of what they stand for, what they don't stand for. So I think there are moves on different parts. And, of course, there's a political spectrum in Ukraine now because it was a relatively pluralistic society with pluralistic media. The spectrum is from extreme left to extreme right. And that's the reality of the situation. How the new government and new authorities and the new country will manage it, I think, so far, I think the first steps are promising, but tensions ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Alexei. Thank you, everybody, for covering the whole waterfront. We really have done it all. As far as I can see, we've done a dramatis personae, we've done the economy, the regions, Russia, the Western reaction, and even BBC coverage. So, well, you got that in there very well there, Alexei, but you are head of deployment, so I understand. We have, unfortunately, only 25 minutes, maybe half an hour if I really push it, because we have to finish when the Twitter feed, or when the live feed finishes, really. So I'll take questions in threes, if I may. So let's start with Bobo first, right in the center. If you could give your name and affiliation, please, ladies and gentlemen, and preferably not Chatham House member, but something more interesting than that. Because most of you are Chatham House members, something more enlightening. And then we'll have Janet next to Bobo, and then the gentleman right here at the front.
My name's Bobo Lowe. I'm an associate fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program here at Chatham House. My question is for Aricia. You talk about the problem of fusion between politics and business, but I see two major issues coming up. One is, how are you going to address this problem of fusion when you have someone like Tymoshenko, who is likely to stand as a presidential candidate who many people consider to be almost the ultimate oligarch? And the second issue is, how is the new Ukrainian government going to build bridges with the East, with the party of the regions, if they don't use their contacts with people like Akhmetov and Firtash and so on?
Okay, could you pass to your right? Yeah.
Thank you. Janet Gunn, independent, no affiliation. I wondered, it's a question really for any of the panel, any member of the panel. Do you think that the West and maybe the actual opposition leaders in the parliament in Ukraine could or should have done more to distance or to distance themselves from the far-right elements and the, well, what you might call extremists? You can decide for yourselves whether filling plastic water bottles with polystyrene and petrol is was justified when the peaceful protest got to that stage. But in a sense, Russia has really jumped on those elements in its propaganda, which Robert referred to. And I just wonder whether elements there and abroad should have done more to separate from them.
Can you pass it 2 rows to the front, please, and the gentleman on the right? Yeah.
Thank you. Tom Fenton, American journalist, member. If the current saber-rattling of the past 48 hours by the Russian government turned out to be something more, how much control would this new government have over the armed forces?
Okay, thank you. Why don't you take Bobo's question first, as it was specifically addressed to you, Aricia, on bridge building, etc.
Well, indeed, I think what the new government in the composition of the ministers did right is in a way distancing itself from having influences inside the government from business. Second, I think the fact that key oligarchs, both Mr. Akhmetov and Kolomoisky, the Privat group in Dnipropetrovsk region, made very clear statements in the way that they support the unity of Ukraine, that they understand that Ukrainians demand change. These people have influence in eastern part of Ukraine. These voices will be heard, and I think the best strategy for the government is really to start action. You know, they have to communicate very clearly what they do. These days, communication is paramount. People have to understand why these reforms take place. They cannot be just, you know, fast decisions taken in the closed rooms. They have to be really open and explain. And I think that by trying to reach out to a moderate part of Party of Regions, you know, people like Tihipko and others, would be important to not to, kind of block them completely, but to keep the channel of exchange, explaining the reforms and having them perhaps on board in some of the regions, because they all understand the danger. I mean, I think right now this issue of unity is across the party list, and I think they will manage to work on it.
Shall I try?
Yeah, absolutely.
The far right, I think, yes, I think the government should have made it clear that there are certain things that they will not be accepting, and I think the leaders of the opposition, Mr. Klitschko and Mr. Yatsenyuk, should have made it clear. Whether they had the opportunity to do it, not really. What happened was that, you know, those petrol bombs and Molotov cocktails, I think they didn't come from the beginning. We almost forget that on the 30th of November, when the association agreement was destroyed and the first people appeared in Maidan, it was extremely peaceful. I think the first event was the beating by Berkut, by the riot police, of students actually who were sleeping during the night, and they were not armed. So there was the dynamics of the conflict, and these groups, Right Sector, Spilna Sprava, Common Cause, which is another one, they became kind of the defense unit around the perimeter, and they were building the barricades, and they started to throw Molotov cocktails and bricks. So there was this development of on the ground that was very visual, and I think one of the things that the media, mea culpa, are doing is very often, look at the pictures. It was the field day for news photographers, burning tires, battles, smoke, all the elements you needed. So you always saw those groups right in the front of action, whereas tens of thousands were standing behind and not doing it. And I think it's always important to keep that in mind.
The vast majority were peaceful.
Absolutely. But I think one element that I think is very important is that I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding of the percentage, of the share of votes that some of the far groups potentially could get. And it's minuscule. It's not the time for opinion polls, but the opinion poll that I saw from mid-January that was done by Sotsy, a very respected polling organization in Ukraine. Ironically, it placed Mr. Yanukovych in first place, 19.6%, if the vote is tomorrow. On the second place, quite surprisingly, was Mr. Poroshenko, and an affiliated person, 19.1%. In the third place, it was Mr. Yatsenyuk at 17%, and Mr. Tyahnybok, the leader of Svoboda Party, was at 3%, just below the communists, which were at 4%. So I think when we're talking about the split in the vote, even in Western Ukraine, I know there are some colleagues here from Western Ukraine, I think Svoboda is not really the leading force. It may have some successes in places like Ternopil, in some of the regions there, but I think proportionately, it's not a major factor.
Thanks. Robert, do you want to address the saber rattling question in particular from this gentleman here? And what I would say, just in advance of that, is that I think the Russians are keeping all the options on the table. But anyway, Robert.
Well, the third question was whether the new government will have the support of the army. And I think Alexei answered that in his presentation at the beginning, that yes, and it is already clear that the government has got the support of what they call the power ministries.
No.
All of them. Defense Ministry, Interior Ministry, Militia, and the Security Service. They're all lined up. But even during the crisis, it's quite clear that the army were divided, reluctant to get involved, and Yanukovych dismissed a couple of senior army commanders, presumably.
Chief of Staff.
Chief of Staff, because they refused to get involved in the repression.
Okay, let's take the next section of three. I've got Ron, followed by the gentleman just here at the front, and followed by Ed on the left. So Ron, right here in the middle, centre.
Thank you, James. Ron Freeman, member of the Supervisory Board of Sberbank of Russia. As the panelists have mentioned, an important ingredient to keeping Ukraine going is credit. And 6 Russian banks are a major source of credit to Ukraine, not just to the government, but to the private sector. And the largest single source is Sberbank, which has $4 billion of loans outstanding. As of Friday, when we had our board meeting in Moscow, those loans were being serviced normally. It was not as if everyone had stopped paying interest or principal. Herman Greff, former economics minister and now CEO of Sberbank, announced publicly, as well as in the board, that new loans were being stopped for the time being. All of the banks, including Sberbank, are very much driven by the Central Bank of Russia, the head of which is now Elvira Nabiullina, whose name I've not heard mentioned.
You need to ask a question now.
Yeah. The question is, what is the strategy to be sure to get this credit flowing again, either via the central bank or directly with the banks present in Russia?
Got it. Thank you. Could you pass 3 to your left, effectively? So, gentleman here at the front again. I will work my way back in the room. Thank you.
Ronald Harrison, former UK diplomat. So far, the Russians have taken an extremely hard line in everything they've said. They denounced the revolution as a fascist coup d'etat, and I suppose it is a coup d'etat, judging by the Egyptian equivalent. They have moved the army into this exercise mode along the frontier with Crimea. they have given protection to Mr. Yanukovych. And what do you think would happen if Mr. Putin, who after all was responsible for invading Georgia, what would he do, what would the West's reaction be if the Russians decided to give protection to the Russians in the Crimea if they decided they wanted to secede from the Ukraine?
Okay, thank you. And the final question of this round is a gentleman sort of left, yeah, right there, thank you.
Yes, Ed Salazar, a former American diplomat and now an independent consultant. Having been in Moscow during the collapse of the Soviet Union, I can appreciate the intensity of the emotion in the Maidan and how it was able to sustain that over the course of the last several weeks, months. One thing I noticed, though, from that is that there wasn't any discussion that I could discern from any of the reports of what comes next. There wasn't sufficient planning in their efforts. They knew what they wanted to accomplish immediately, but there didn't seem to be any strategy behind their ideas about how to change Ukraine. And I'm struck by this in particular because in an interview 2 days after the crowd started to gather in the Maidan, Mr. Yutsenko told a CNN interviewer that the reason the Orange Revolution failed is because Ukrainians weren't ready to change the system in Ukraine. And he said, and they still aren't, but that shouldn't keep us from trying. So my question is really, what comes next? I can appreciate that this will be a transitional government, that we are looking at the sacrificial lambs that are now running the government, but what comes next?
Okay, thank you. Right, that's a strategy series of questions. Economic strategy, Russian strategy, and what next more broadly. Do you want to maybe take the first question first, Alexei, perhaps?
Banks, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, that's an easy one. Okay, I understand that VTB has stopped issuing credit. There was the first Russian bank, which is, I think, quite significant. And I understand that there was Deputy Finance Minister of the Russian Federation announced yesterday that the next tranche of this $15 billion loan is not forthcoming for the time being. So the situation is very, very difficult. I mentioned the current account. I mentioned the various payments that are due very, very soon. And I think the realization is that Ukraine doesn't have the money. I think the currency reserved, foreign currency reserved, have dropped from 22 to 15. And 15 is, you know, it's a bare minimum. So I think without the international assistance, it's impossible for Ukraine to service its debt at the moment, which is why IMF is flying in, I think, on Monday. And there will be some kind of emergency assistance. I understand that the United States also announced that there will be some kind of cash advance or at least servicing of some of the debt with the American involvement. But so far, I think the Russian position was wait and see, and until the new government is there, and until perhaps that government becomes legitimate in the Russian diplomatic parlance, there won't be anything forthcoming.
That emergency financial assistance is being discussed with the EU as well, and William Hague was in Washington talking to the Americans about it.
Do you want to answer the question on what if Vladimir Putin was perhaps a little bit more excited than
what if the Russians decided to go in to protect Russians in Crimea? I think it would be awful, and Western governments have already been telling him privately and issuing very public warnings, don't do it. Not least, the Ukrainians would resist. There would be a huge battle.
But can I just add one line? I think it's very, very important and very interesting that Mr. Putin so far hasn't said a word, neither in Sochi nor after Sochi. And I think all the statements are being done either by, you know, second-tier diplomats, by the anonymous statements of the foreign ministry, and Mr. Lavrov spoke once. But I think it's very, very interesting that nothing is coming directly from the Kremlin. And I think that, to me, certainly indicates that perhaps he is sort of holding his space open in order either to be a peacekeeper or to be a defender of the faith of whatever. So the options are still there. But I think it will, until he speaks, I don't think we can talk about what Russian intention is.
But if I may just also add to the Western toolbox, there is a Budapest memorandum that was signed in 1994 when Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons. And today, Chancellor Merkel referred to it in the parliamentary speech here in London, saying that both United States, United Kingdom, and Russia guarantee territorial integrity of Ukraine. So that's something very important to keep in mind. And on what's next? What's next is from what it started. It's an association agreement with Ukraine, with European Union. I think that's why people went out on the street, and this agreement has a work plan, a roadmap for the government to do. It's now more difficult, taking into account the instability in Ukraine and the depths of financial crisis in Ukraine. But I think the new economic team will bet on deregulation, growth of enterprise, small and medium enterprise, restructuring some of the difficult industries, such as mining, for example, and foreign investors. This is the rescue package that I think they will try, in addition to getting...
Just one line to add. I think the new government said they want to sign the association agreement on the 21st of March, which is very soon.
I'll try and get 2 more rounds of 3 questions each in. I'm being very front-centric, so if people at the back could catch my eye after this, then I will try to get to the back. But let's go with Nick Redmond first, front left.
Thank you. Nicholas Redmond, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. 2 or 3 months ago, polls were quite consistent, showing that if there was a presidential election next Sunday, it would be a runoff then between Yanukovych and either Yatsenyuk or Klitschko. Now that Yanukovych is no longer on the scene and Tymoshenko is out of prison, what is our panel's view on who the 2 names might be in late May?
Right. Then middle section, 3 rows back on the left.
Mark Berenson, Keynes Russia Institute. I wanted to push you all a bit further on language policy and unification of the country. One of the first things that Viktor Yushchenko did when he became president after the Orange Revolution was to push for a new language policy that suddenly lost the trust of those in eastern Ukraine. Most people in eastern Ukraine get their news from Russian state television. And I wonder whether it's recognized, perhaps by those who are on the Maidan, those who are now in power, as to whether that situation needs to change, that Ukrainians on all sides of the country need to be getting their media and news from inside the country. And Channel 5, for example, I think this week announced that they're going to have an hour of news in Russian in prime time. And I was wondering whether you think this is going to change in the future, maybe looking back at the language issue that was just passed and revising it again.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, front row, striped tie, just at the very front, please. Thank you.
My question would be direct and short.
Great.
What the West will do if Russia decides to invade Ukraine in the pretext to protect...
What if Russia, sorry?
If Russia decides to invade the Ukraine to protect its own people. And secondly, why the West has been so keen throughout this process to help the Ukraine?
Okay. So, Patricia, do you want to start with a presidential election question from Nick?
Well, good news is that if Ukraine will be democracy, it will be impossible to tell now who will be the next president of Ukraine. If it were Belarus, I would give you an answer. So it's a good news. Now, there are options, and this big question is whether Yulia Tymoshenko will run at all. We don't know. She left to Germany for treatment. How the events will evolve, we don't know. But if she runs, let's make a scenario around this, there would probably be 3 key names, which will be Tymoshenko, former boxer Klitschko, and Serhiy Tihipko, who is from the Party of Regions. And under this scenario, I would not exclude that Mr. Tihipko from the Party of Regions may win. We don't know. It's really very difficult to make these predictions, and everything depends on, of course, how the new government will be able to consolidate the belief in European future of Ukraine, that pro-European, pro-reformist parties can deliver what they were dying for.
Alexei, what about the language question?
Language question. I think language question in Ukraine, I've been discussing it for the past 50 years, I think. But I think the interesting thing about the language issue in Ukraine is not what it is, but what people want it to be. And what I have in mind is that in terms of usage of language, the problem is not really there. In Kiev alone, 25% of schools are Russian. In Sevastopol, there's not a single Ukrainian school, as far as I remember. In terms of, you come to every newspaper kiosk, I think the bulk of the newspapers there will be in Russian. I think Ukrainian book publishers have a problem of selling books in Ukrainian, but not necessarily books in Russian. So I think in terms of usage, in terms of access to the media, I actually disagree. I think if you want to create a united nation in Ukraine, all you need to do is to allow the nation to watch Dmitry Kiselyov, Vesti of the Week on Russian television once a week, and that is better patriotic education than anything else. So in terms of access, I think, in terms of usage, there isn't really a problem. The problem is in the status of the language, and I think this is around which the whole political debate has been going on, whether it should have the state level, the level of the state language or the second state language or not. And I think around this, this is connected to the whole concept of unitarian Ukraine or federal Ukraine or the Ukraine of historical provinces. So whichever way you want to spin it, you can find flaws in either position. But I think what the Yushchenko government did, I agree with you. I think they pushed too far, not necessarily in banning the use of Russian, but pushing the use of Ukrainian into the areas where the population was not susceptible strongly enough. Mm-hmm. And some of the things were really silly in terms of dubbing of films, for example. They just irritate people. And the languages are close, and Ukraine is a bilingual country and needs to take pride in it rather than be ashamed of it. And I think, we interviewed somebody from Donetsk the other day, and he was saying, why should I fill in my tax declaration in Ukrainian? Why can't I have it like in Canada in 2 languages? What's the big problem? And very often in Ukraine, there isn't really a big problem, but nobody is brave enough to say there isn't a big problem. Let's just do it.
Thanks. Robert, the last question had also kind of been asked before as well, but the addendum to it was that what if the Russians go in defense of their own people? Perhaps you could take that on.
Well, that would be the pretext. You can see there's a certain amount of preparing the arguments, as there was for Afghanistan in 1979 or Georgia in 2008. I don't myself think they're going to do it, use military force. I think it'd be utterly stupid, given the risks involved. But if they did, just hypothetically, there would be a huge reaction. Now, in the Security Council, Russia would be able to veto any action by the UN. But at the moment, they're a member of the G8. Economically, should they be a member of the G8? There would likely be sanctions on the Russian leadership, probably personal sanctions, hitting them in the wallet where it hurts, and things like that.
Okay, we do have time for 3 very brief questions, please. If we could go, yes, gentleman in the yellow tie right here. I'm afraid I'm not going to be...
My name is Euripides. I'm the High Commissioner of Cyprus. Sorry about this.
It's
okay. Like the American colleague, I also served in Russia, in Moscow, 1988, 1993. We had the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were some lessons learned from that, I think. The panel have been dancing around it. It was mentioned clearly, I think by Robert, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, that we in the West shouldn't be triumphant vis-a-vis Russia. Don't back it in the corner, make it part of the solution. Some specifics, please, on this. And okay. I say so without taking anything away from democracy, human rights, and the rule of law.
Yeah, glasses, far right section, white shirt, black tie, that's right. Not pravi sector. Yeah, please.
Hi, William Scott Gould from Kroll.
Could you stand up, please?
Yes, William Scott Gould from Kroll. My question is around sanctions again. There's a lot of capital flight out of Russia, and particularly out of Ukraine now. Should the Western financial institutions be doing more to block that money?
Okay. And right here at the front, in the jeans, yes, please, thank you. Yep, absolutely. No, to your, no, sorry, sir, to your left. Well, it was actually.
My name is Bogdan Tsiup and I'm a Ukrainian journalist. My
louder,
question is about corruption. Well, now we see that Yanukovych regime was stealing everything that was not bolted down to the floor.
Yeah.
And that was one of the main reasons for the revolution and why people were indignant. My question is about the role of the West, because from the documents that are coming out now, we see that lots of money were laundered in the Western countries, in Europe, in Britain. Shell companies were used, and so on. So how would you explain to the Ukrainians what Britain, for example, can or cannot do when we are talking about lots of money that are probably parked in London City now?
Got it. Okay, thank you. Right, Robert, examples of not being triumphalist.
Right. Well, I'll pick up the second point from the gentleman in the front. Why does the West care so much about Ukraine? Because since 1991 they've been an independent state, and it's preserving that state's sovereignty and independence. How do we show that the West is not triumphalist? Involve Russia, discuss with them, as leaders of Western countries are doing already. Talk to them about how we can all help with a financial package coming together, using the IMF to coordinate it. And as I said in my introductory remarks, I do see a role for some sort of international process involving the Ukrainians, not over their heads, talking with them, but with other powers with an interest, on how do we in future avoid this antagonism, reach a situation where we all agree on a future status of Ukraine.
Thank you. Alexei, maybe the role of Western IFIs? Giving you
yes.
economic questions, aren't
yeah.
they? Sorry.
No, I think it's a very important question. I agree very much with what you said, that there's a lot of responsibility for the level of corruption in Ukraine that's resting with Western countries. I'm very happy to see that Austria is now investigating the Kluyev brothers and their shell companies. I think Cyprus has a lot of work to do on this, because for many, many years Cyprus was Cyprus was the largest investor in Ukraine for many, many years, much bigger than Germany, much bigger than European Union combined. And I know the climate is wonderful, but I think there were probably other reasons for the money flows. I think Britain and offshore companies are certainly there. British Virgin Islands are featuring very, very prominently. And the way the new authorities would need to handle it, I think, there's been a lot of investigation done by very, very brave and very dedicated journalists with the help of international anti-corruption organizations. The schemes are there, the money flows, the investment flows, they're all there. I think now is a good moment to actually restart it, because previously the Ukrainian authorities certainly didn't pay any attention, and a lot of the people supporting the Ukrainian authorities were probably getting good salaries and were not in the position to basically disclose some of the secrets.
Thank you, Alexei. Finally, Arisia, really just in 1 minute, role of the West, sanctions, etc.
Yeah, I think it's very good, the effort of diplomacy that Robert mentioned here, but I think it was a bit too late. I think when the first human victims shot down by snipers, the European Union should have introduced sanctions without waiting for more casualties. And I think now that the Council of Ministers said A, we will do the sanctions, there has to be B by actually having these imposed and in a way exposed that they are taking place, to give a lesson to other dictators who will be trying to withstand the people power in the post-Soviet space. This is just the beginning, I think, as the slogan of Euromaidan was. This is just the beginning, and this is not just the beginning in Ukraine. I think it's in a way the beginning in the region, and it's been followed very closely in other countries, and people are taking their lessons, and I think the West should really give solidarity in a way by following up on these people who were involved in violence, in violating brutally human rights, and they should come to follow up on these sanctions.
Good for you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. I apologize for having gone on. I'm in big trouble with the Chatham House authorities.
Yeah.
Secondly, would you like to join us on the ground floor for a reception? And firstly, would you like please to thank Arisia, Robert and Alexei?